Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Calculus of Violence: How Americans Fought the Civil War by Aaron Sheehan-Dean, narrated by Boehmer. Introduction. The Puzzle of the Civil War. The U.S. Civil War was, by a wide measure, the bloodiest conflict in American history. It consumed 750,000 lives, including nearly 1/4 of the white men of military age living in the South. The Civil War featured traditional battles that pitted uniformed soldiers against one another, and gruesome acts of irregular warfare committed by guerrillas against regular soldiers and civilians. It incorporated hostage-taking, imprisonment, banishment, and mass killings. Nonetheless, at many points, Northerners and Southerners chose restraint. Soldiers on both sides took prisoners, respected flags of truce, and directed their weapons at each other rather than at non-combatants. Politicians and citizens demanded their nations observe the laws of war, and enslaved people sought freedom rather than revenge in the chaos of the conflict. If not for these actions, the already high death toll could have escalated dramatically. In order to understand this puzzle, a catastrophic war that could have been much worse, this book examines how people on both sides justified the lethal violence of the conflict, and when, how, and why they balanced cruelty and destruction with restraint and mercy. Who could be killed in the Civil War? Who could do that killing? How did they justify their actions? In short, why was the Civil War so bloody? And conversely, how did participants avoid what Lincoln most feared, a remorseless revolutionary struggle? The answers lie in the thoughts and actions of the Civil War's participants. Sometimes they drew upon deeply held beliefs, and at other times they acted spontaneously in unanticipated situations. The answers changed over time, and in the uncertainty of war, participants contradicted themselves from moment to moment. As a result, the patterns of violence in the conflict did not follow a path of steady growth. The limited to total war paradigm, which argues that the war inexorably grew more violent each year, dominates both academic and popular histories of the war. But it mischaracterizes the conflict. The reassurance offered by this narrative, common to descriptions of nearly all wars, conceals the more complicated reality of a conflict in which local patterns of violence and peace varied across time and space. In some places, the war was more unrestrained in 1861 than 1865, and in other places, the opposite held true. The Civil War was not either restrained or violent. It was both. Malice and charity occurred simultaneously, sometimes in the same places. Moving beyond a binary formulation helps us see the ways in which people understood some acts of violence as immoral and wasteful, and others as necessary and just. This book brings together the regular and irregular aspects of the war. It examines the behavior of politicians, officers, soldiers, guerrillas, prisoners, and citizens. It analyzes what they did and how they justified what they did. It explores the gaps and discrepancies between action and rhetoric, between reality and theory. The result is an analysis of the war that operates on two levels. Within the conflict, I track how Federals and Confederates engaged with each other over those issues that could most easily enable lethal violence to spiral out of control: guerrillas, emancipation, prisoners, and occupation. If we look only at the ground level and focus on these issues, as previous historians have done, we see a war that is often bloody and only occasionally restrained. If we pull back, employ hindsight, and broaden the frame of reference to include other civil and national conflicts in the mid-19th century, the American experience appears unusual for the degree of restraint exercised by participants. These conflicting conclusions, that the Civil War was defined by unnecessary violence and death, and also by restraint, are produced by shifting our own perspective on the event, as we must do with the passage of time. Recognizing that the U.S. Civil War, compared to contemporaneous conflicts, included more moments of restraint and charity, does not minimize the degree of suffering, even unjust suffering, borne during the conflict. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald's definition of first-rate intelligence, a full understanding of the Civil War requires that we hold two contrary ideas in our heads simultaneously. In three important spheres of the war, participants engaged each other in ways that discouraged restraint and escalated the war's violence. The Confederacy's willingness to tolerate guerrillas proved a fateful choice. Their presence in the war subjected non-combatants to lethal violence and compelled the Union to devise a counterinsurgency strategy that exacted a devastating toll on Southern civilians. In response to the Union's mid-war endorsement of emancipation and its enlistment of black men into U.S. armies, the Confederacy subjected black soldiers to unjust violence throughout the conflict. The last factor stimulating violence was the strong sense of nationalism that bound participants to their cause and encouraged a vision of the enemy as corrupt and unworthy. This message came from newspaper editors, politicians' speeches, and ministers' sermons, and it increased over the course of the war, compelling people to fight longer and tolerate greater bloodshed, both their own and their enemies. The most important restraining influence countering these forces was the state. In the Union and the Confederacy, central governments set limits on violence. Because both states curried the favor of international observers, they professed adherence to the laws of war, which sanctioned lethal violence only against combatants. Neither side observed this principle perfectly, but the experience of the Civil War reveals that states matter. The most destructive 19th-century wars, like the Caste War of the Yucatan or the Taiping Civil War, involved actors who did not aspire to statehood or who rejected the Western laws of war. The state's role in regulating behavior can be seen in several ways. First, both places practiced regular war, with the important exception of the Confederacy's use of guerrillas. Even potentially catastrophic moments like sieges and artillery bombardments of towns and cities occurred in legal and deliberate ways. Second, both sides took prisoners of war rather than treating enemy combatants as criminals and executing them, as happened in the wake of the Paris Commune in 1871. Although many Civil War prisoners suffered and died needlessly while incarcerated. Third, despite the outcry by Confederate civilians, Union occupants of Southern cities rarely entailed much lethal violence. One last factor that manifested itself through official channels also encouraged moderation in the Union's pursuit of military victory. Abraham Lincoln, most U.S. military officers, and a majority of the Republican Party regarded Confederates as wayward citizens who could be restored to loyalty and then to full civil life. Black Northerners and white abolitionists opposed this view and sanctioned a more destructive and sometimes more violent conflict with the Confederacy. But they rarely held the levers of power. This political dynamic ensured that the Northerners who created and implemented war policy restrained themselves in ways that did not occur in similar conflicts in other places. Any useful study of violence.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?